The wind slammed against the cabin walls like it meant to tear the roof clean off. Clara Rourke pressed her back against the door, bracing it with both hands until the latch caught again. The old pine frame shuddered under the force. Snow swirled in sheets beyond the window, thick as smoke. Somewhere outside, the barn door creaked once, then slammed open with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. She cursed under her breath and wrapped her wool shawl, tighter fingers stiff from the cold that seeped through every crack in the wood. Another night like this, and she wouldn't just be alone, she'd be buried. She grabbed the lantern and pushed through the door before fear could argue otherwise. The snow came sideways. Each step sank ankle deep. She followed the path by feel more memory than sight, until the barn loomed ahead, barely visible in the flurry. Inside, the old cow was restless, huffing clouds of breath into the straw. The latch had snapped clean. She tied it back with a bit of frayed rope and ran her hand down the animal's neck, whispering softly, "There, girl. Easy. I'm still here." The cow let out a low, mournful groan that echoed the ache in Clara's chest. She hadn't heard another human voice in 13 days. Not since the storm season truly set in. Not since the town stopped checking in. Not since the world decided she was better off a ghost. Back in the cabin, she lit the stove again and poured the last of the milk into a tin pail of thin, watery stuff that had to stretch a week more somehow. The fire crackled weakly behind her. Her hands shook from more than just cold. She was tired of doing everything alone, but saying it out loud felt like weakness. And Clara Rourke didn't do well. Not until the knock. It came soft, barely there, like a memory trying to be forgotten. 3 short raps on the wooden door, followed by silence. Not the howl of wind, not the moan of wood. A knock. She froze. No one came up this far. Not unless they were desperate or dangerous. She reached for the rifle by the window, old but loaded. She moved to the door slowly, quietly, her heart hammering loud enough to drown out the storm. Then came a voice, low, male, ragged with cold and fatigue. "Ma'am, don't mean no harm. Just need a little milk if there's any to spare." Her breath caught. Milk. She hesitated, fingers tight around the rifle stock. Through the fogged window pane, she saw him, a man standing just beyond the porch, hat in hand coat, torn beard, stiff with frost. His shoulders slumped forward like a broken hinge. He didn't step closer. He didn't threaten. Just waited. Clara didn't know what made her do it. Maybe it was the way he didn't meet her eyes. Maybe it was the fact he was holding out a wooden cup, not a weapon. Or maybe it was the kind of silence around him, the heavy kind only grief can teach a man. She cracked open the door, letting a blast of wind cut through the cabin. "Wait at the fence," she called, loud enough to be heard over the storm. "I'll bring it." He nodded once and stepped back without a word. She filled the pail slowly, the sound of milk striking tin louder than it should have been. It echoed in the quiet like a prayer. When she stepped outside again, the snow had softened. He stood just beyond the fence, head bowed slightly, the cup still in his hands. Their fingers brushed when she handed it over. Just for a moment. Her skin tingled from the contact, from the cold, or maybe the surprise of it. His hands were rough. Her hands trembled. He didn't speak at first, just held the pail close like something sacred. Then, voice breaking, he murmured, "Thank you." She nodded once. It should have ended there. He should have turned and left. She should have gone back inside, latched the door, counted her loss. But instead, her voice rose without her permission. "You'll freeze before the ridge," she said. He stopped mid-step. Snow blew sideways between them. The world waited. "I've got a fire," she said, quieter now. "And one night's warmth. That's all." He didn't move. She stepped aside from the door, leaving it open. Still, he didn't move. Then finally, wordless, he crossed the porch, the pail still in his hands. Inside, he stood by the door, stiff as the coat on his back. He watched her like a man expecting to be kicked back out any second. She poured the milk into a kettle, set it to warm, then slid him the old tin cup. He held it with both hands like it might vanish. No words, no questions, just steam and silence and two people with too many miles behind them. Finally, after the fire popped and settled, she asked, "Where were you camped north?" he said, eyes still down. "The horse went lame. Haven't eaten since Tuesday." "Your name?" He hesitated. "Elias." She said nothing more. Minutes passed quiet, except for the wind's low growl beyond the walls. It wasn't peaceful yet, but it wasn't empty either. When he stood to leave, she offered him the lantern. "You'll need this," she said. "The moon's gone." He stared at it, then at her. "Return it when you can," she added. Their hands met again, this time deliberate. Not affection, not an obligation. Recognition. He stepped back into the snow, the lantern's flickering glow swallowed quickly by the dark. Clara stood in the doorway long after he was gone, her breath fogging and the cold heart pounding for reasons she didn't want to name. Something in her had shifted. Not much, just enough to notice. She sat back by the fire, staring into the flame. The cup is still warm in her hands. She should have been afraid. She should have shut the door behind him. But she hadn't. And she wasn't. Instead, she left the lantern burning in the window, its small, steady glow casting a narrow path across the snow. She didn't know his name, but somehow she was already waiting for him to return. The lantern was back by morning. Clara spotted it through the window, its faint flicker barely holding on against the frost that had crept up the glass overnight. She opened the door slowly. The snow had eased into a soft hush, blanketing everything in stillness. The lantern sat where she'd left it on the porch rail, its glass frosted but intact, its little flame miraculously alive. Beside it was a small bundle wrapped in worn hide. She bent down, fingers stiff from cold, and unwrapped it to find a half-full jar of honey and a folded note. The handwriting was uneven, almost shy. For the milk. E. Clara stared at the note for a long moment. Then, without meaning to, she smiled. The honey shimmered in the morning light, amber and impossibly bright against the snow. She brought it inside and poured a spoonful into her tea. It tasted like something she hadn't let herself feel in months' gentleness. By midday, she was outside stacking wood when she heard the sound of boots crunching snow. He was back. Elias walked up the hill slowly, a bundle of firewood slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just stopped at the fence, set the wood down, and nodded once. Clara crossed her arms more to hide her nerves than to block the cold. "You didn't have to come back," she said. He shrugged. "Trade's fair, isn't it?" She wanted to say more, but the moment didn't ask for words. Instead, she pointed toward the shed. "You've earned a warm meal at least." He hesitated but nodded again. That afternoon, he mended the broken rails along her fence, working in silence but with care. His movements were methodical, deliberate, as if the wood deserved patience. Clara watched from the porch, arms tucked into her shawl, the steam from her breath rising like a quiet promise. When the sun began to slip behind the ridge, she brought him a bowl of stew. They sat on the steps, not quite side by side, sharing food like two people who'd done this before, even if they hadn't. He ate slow like someone not used to company, like someone learning not to rush time. Inside the cabin, the fire popped and settled, casting long shadows on the floorboards. Elias glanced through the open door toward the stove. His eyes landed on a small row of glass jars, lined up neatly on the shelf above it. "You keep those for a reason?" he asked. Clara followed his gaze. Pickled beets, preserved pears, dried herbs in burlap pouches, all labeled in her husband's faded handwriting. "I keep them there," she said, "so I remember I've still got something left." Elias didn't answer right away. He just nodded, thoughtful. "Then I'll bring more tomorrow," he said finally. "So it all stays." Something lodged in her chest. Not pain exactly. Something softer, older. He left before the moon rose, like he had a rule about overstaying. Clara watched him disappear down the hill until even the sound of his boots was swallowed by snow. But this time, the silence didn't feel hollow. It felt like it had been filled with something and then left behind to keep warm. The days began to stack quietly, steadily, like logs added to a growing pile. Elias returned each afternoon, sometimes with wood, once with a small deer, another time with wild herbs wrapped in cloth. He didn't say where he found them. He didn't have to. Clara began to expect the knock on the fence, the quiet nod, the calm that followed him like a shadow. She found herself listening for his footsteps, watching for that flicker of movement through the trees. She told herself it was just comfort, nothing more. But comfort, once unfamiliar, becomes a kind of yearning. One evening, while she shelled beans by the stove, Maggie Lee arrived. The younger woman brushed snow off her shoulders, cheeks red from the cold, and stepped inside without knocking. "I heard you've got a regular visitor these days," she said with a sly smile. Clara raised an eyebrow. Word travels faster than truth. Maggie sat beside her, pulled off her gloves. Truth tends to catch up. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of beans dropping into a tin bowl, soft and steady. "He's not like the others," Clara said finally. Maggie looked at her. "I didn't think he was. But that won't stop the town from wagging tongues." "I don't care." Maggie gave a small, knowing smile. "You care more than you want to." Clara didn't answer. After Maggie left, Clara stood at the window and watched the snow drift across the ridge. It was darker tonight, the moon hidden. No lantern light yet. No footsteps. And then just when she turned to walk away, she saw him, coming up the trail, slow and steady, carrying something in his arms. A bundle of firewood, no something larger. He came closer, and the shape took form, a broken axe handle. His coat was damp. His face was tight with something unreadable. She met him at the fence. "Trouble?" she asked. Elias nodded. "A rancher stopped me. Said I was cutting wood on his land." Clara's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. Tom Harrow." He didn't confirm. "I didn't need to. He's had his eye on this ridge for years," she muttered. Elias looked away, eyes low. "Folks see a man alone and figure he's guilty of something." She saw it then, the flicker in his eyes. Shame. The same look he wore that first night at her fence. And something in her refused to let it settle again. "I'll take care of it," she said firmly. Elias started to protest, but she cut him off with a look. "Don't argue." He stood there for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod. Clara turned back toward the cabin, her heart thudding like hooves on frozen ground. The next morning, she hitched her small wagon and rode into town for the first time in months. She should have been afraid of him, but instead she feared what it meant that she wasn't. Clara hadn't planned on speaking when she got to town. She'd hitched the mule, bundled her coat tight against the wind, and told herself it was just a supply run. Flour, salt, maybe coffee if Jed still had any worth brewing. She'd walk in, walk out, nothing more. But when she passed the saloon and saw Tom Harrow leaning against the post rail, a smirk painted across his face like he was waiting for her. Something shifted inside her. Not fear, not even anger. Something older, something stubborn. He tipped his hat when she approached. "Heard you've got company up on that hill, Clara." She didn't slow, "and I heard you're still breathing. Life's full of disappointments." Tom's grin faded just a flicker, but enough to satisfy. "Careful what sort you take in," he called after her. "Stray dogs bite when you feed 'em." Clara stopped, turned, and with the entire saloon porch watching, she said clear and steady, "That man's done more honest work in a week than you've done all winter. You stay off my land, Tom, and off his path, too." Tom's mouth opened like he might spit a response, but she didn't wait to hear it. The general store was quiet. Jed Hawkins looked up from his ledger, eyes narrowing when he saw her. "Well now," he said, "look who winter didn't swallow whole." Clara smiled despite herself. "I need flour. And news, if you've got any worth hearing." Jed scratched his beard, motioned toward the back room. "Flour I got. News depends if you're buying it or just looking." She hesitated, then added, "It's about Elias Boone." Jed looked up sharply. "That's a name I haven't heard in some time. You know him, knew him. Used to trap further north. His brother Micah Boone was a hell of a shot. Folks say he died in the Yukon 2 winters ago. Avalanche took their whole camp." Jed paused. "After that, Elias just disappeared." Clara let that sit for a moment. "You think he's dangerous?" Jed met her eyes squarely. "I think he's a man who's survived things most people don't. That makes folks nervous. Doesn't make them right." Clara nodded once. "That's all I needed." She left town with the sun slipping lower behind the ridge, the cold sharp against her cheeks, but her mind sharper still. She didn't feel brave. She felt certain. And that was enough. Back at the cabin, Elias was mending the trap line near the tree line. She called his name once. He didn't look up, but he heard. Over stew that evening, she told him about the town, about Harrow, about Jed. He didn't say much, just listened, jaw set, hands tight around the tin cup. "You shouldn't have to fight for me," he said finally. "Maybe not," Lara said. "But you shouldn't have to fight alone either." He looked at her, then really looked. There was something unguarded in his face she hadn't seen before, a hesitation, like a man trying to remember what trust felt like. "I've been up there for too long," he said after a while. "Mountains get quiet, but they don't forgive." Clara's voice was low. "You don't need to forgive. You need a place to land." The words hung between them like smoke. Elias didn't answer. He just nodded and went back to work. The next few days settled into a rhythm. Elias chopped wood. Clara baked bread. Maggie stopped by with a poultice for Elias's hands, calloused and cracked from years of frostbite and work. "Does he ever talk to you?" Maggie asked quietly, while Elias was outside. Clara nodded. "When it matters. That's how the real ones do it." Clara watched him through the window, his coat patched where she'd sewn it, shoulders stooped slightly, as he split a log clean. "There's a stillness in him," Clara said, "like someone who's learned not to ask for anything, because no one ever said yes." Maggie placed her hand gently on Clara's. Then maybe it's time someone did. That night, the wind rose again, soft but steady. The kind of wind that doesn't scream, it whispers, and it lingers. Clara found herself sitting by the fire alone after Elias had turned in early, running her thumb over the edge of a small wooden carving left on the mantel. She hadn't noticed it before. A bird, wings tucked in, perched on nothing, as if it was waiting. She held it close, the smoothness of the whittled wood warming slowly in her palm. He had made this, quietly, deliberately, and left it without mention. It wasn't affection, it was something else. Recognition. She brought it to the table, set it beside the honey jar, and stared at it like it might speak. Outside, the wind curled around the cabin. The fire cracked. And in the quiet, Clara realized something she hadn't let herself think since the knock on her door. She didn't want him to leave, but she didn't know if that meant he should stay. The next day, he brought a deer, dressed, clean, hung across his shoulders like a statement. She watched him from the porch, the bird carving still in her pocket. He laid the deer down without a word and looked up at her. "I owe you something more than pelts," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. He looked away. "That's the part I don't know how to believe." She stepped forward just close enough to be heard without raising her voice. "You don't have to believe it all at once. Just start somewhere." That night, the wind blew stronger than it had in weeks. Clara banked the fire. Elias checked the doors. They worked without speaking, like two people who'd done it before, like a rhythm remembered. Outside, the storm started to rise. Inside, something settled, a quiet that didn't feel empty. Not anymore. And just before the lamps went out, Clara reached into her coat and placed the small wooden bird on the mantel in plain view this time. She didn't say a word. But when Elias saw it the next morning, he looked at her differently. Like something in him had started to unfreeze. Like something might fly again. He handed her the carving without a word, a tiny bird with its wings tucked in, just beginning to open. Clara heard the horses before she saw them. 3 of them. Hooves crunching sharp over the snow-crusted path, cutting through the stillness like a warning shot. She stood on the porch, sleeves rolled up and arms dusted in flour, a half-kneaded loaf waiting in the kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside just as the riders came into view. Tom Harrow led them. Big, broad, red-faced from whiskey or wind, it was hard to tell. Behind him rode 2 younger men, lean and mean-looking, both armed, neither smiling. Elias stepped out of the shed at the same moment, shovel in hand. His eyes flicked to the horses, then to Clara. She gave him the slightest shake of her head. "Let me handle this." Tom pulled his horse up at the fence and leaned forward, gloved hands resting on the horn of his saddle. "Morning, Miss Rourke," he drawled, too polite to be genuine. "Hell of a day to play host." Clara crossed her arms. "Didn't know I was expecting company." Tom gestured toward Elias without looking at him. "This one's been hunting on my land. Deer fresh, saw the tracks myself." Elias didn't flinch. "I took it on the West Ridge. That land's common." Was Tom snapped? Not anymore. "Paperwork's filed. Everything west of the creek's under my claim now." Clara's voice cut clean. "That creek runs dry half the year and splits the valley. You don't own the air, Tom." One of the men behind him shifted, hand drifting close to the butt of his pistol. Elias didn't move, but Clara saw the slight tightening in his jaw. Tom leaned back in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "You siding with him over your own kind." Clara didn't blink. "Folk don't act like you." "He does." The air went still. No wind, no sound. Even the horses seemed to wait. Then Tom spat into the snow. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. She met his gaze and held it. "Not likely." He turned his horse without another word. The others followed, casting hard looks back at Elias as they rode off. When they disappeared over the ridge, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Elias still stood by the shed, watching the trail, shoulders tense. "You shouldn't have done that," he said without turning. "I've heard that before," she replied. "Didn't stop me then either." He looked at her jaw, working like he wanted to say more but didn't. Inside the cabin felt too quiet after the confrontation. Clara went back to the bread, working the dough harder than needed. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from something deeper, some old buried anger that finally had breath again. Elias sat near the hearth, sharpening a blade with steady hands. The scraping sound filled the room. After a while he spoke. "He's not going to let this go, I know. If I leave, it might cool things down." Clara dropped the dough into the pan and turned to him, flour dusting her sleeves like snow. "Is that what you want, to leave?" His silence was answer enough. She crossed to the table and sat. "When my husband died, Tom offered to buy this place for half what it was worth. Called it a mercy deal. Said a woman alone up here wouldn't last a winter." Elias looked up slowly. "He wants what he's always wanted," Clara said. "But he doesn't get to scare me off. And you—" her voice softened. "You don't get to vanish just because it's easier." Elias let out a breath long and low. "I ain't afraid of Tom Harrow," he said. Clara nodded. "Good. Then don't act like you are." That night, snow started falling again. Soft at first, like ash from a fire long gone cold. Clara found herself restless. She stood at the window watching flakes drift past the glass, thinking of Tom's eyes, the threat behind the calm. She didn't doubt he'd be back, but she didn't regret the choice she'd made. She thought of Maggie's words, "You care more than you want to." And now she knew it was true. Later, as the fire crackled low, she noticed Elias staring into the flames, eyes far away. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded once slowly. "I've had men come at me with knives, with rifles. But it's different when they come with law behind them. You think he's got a law?" He gave a bitter laugh. "He's got power. Sometimes that's all it takes." Clara moved to the mantel and reached for the small wooden bird, turning it over in her fingers. Its wings were still tucked in, but she wondered if they ever would open. "You're not a threat, Elias," she said. "You're just not invisible anymore. That scares men like Tom." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. The storm picked up wind, curling around the cabin like fingers trying to get in. They moved together, wordless, banking, the fire sealing the windows, checking the door. When it was done, Elias sat near the hearth again, shoulders slack, a different kind of tired in his face. There was a time he said quietly, "I thought I'd never come back down. Figured the cold would just take me slow and clean." Clara didn't speak. She sat beside him, close but not touching. "But the night I found your fence," he shook his head. "I couldn't make my legs turn back." She looked at him, then really looked. "Maybe you weren't meant to," she said. His gaze met hers steady. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, without thinking, she reached out, fingertips brushing the back of his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, trembling slightly. But he didn't pull away. He just let it happen. Outside, the storm raged louder. Inside, something else settled. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was closer than either of them had been in a long time. He turned to leave again, but this time her voice stopped him. Don't make me brave this alone. The wind changed before nightfall. It didn't howl the way it had before. It pressed low and heavy, like something settling in for a long siege. The trees groaned under the weight of gathering snow. The sky, pale gray since morning, now folded into itself, thickening like wet wool. Clara stepped outside, shawl tight around her shoulders, and looked west. The clouds had dropped lower, smothering the ridgeline. A storm was coming, not the usual kind, but one that had the air holding its breath. By the time Elias brought in the last of the firewood, the sun was gone and the first flakes were falling. "We're in for it," he muttered, brushing snow off his coat. Clara nodded. "Storm's got teeth tonight." He didn't argue. They didn't waste time. They moved like they'd done it together 100 times, stacking wood by the hearth, checking the latches, pulling the quilts from the cedar chest. Later, while Clara stirred a pot of stew on the stove, a knock came at the door, quick, familiar light. Maggie. She stepped inside in a rush of cold air, and Pine Needle's arms full of wrapped parcels. "Heard the wind shift," she said. "Figured you could use company." Clara smiled and took her coat. "You have the best timing." Maggie eyed Elias, who gave her a silent nod and went back to tending the fire. Dinner passed with more silence than words, but not an uncomfortable kind. Just warm, tired people waiting out what couldn't be stopped. They ate slowly. Outside, the storm began to roar. By the time the wind hit full force, it rattled the shutters hard enough to shake the lamp glass. "The door's solid," Elias said, voice steady. "We'll ride it out." "I've seen worse," Maggie added, then leaned back against the rocking chair, eyes half closed. "But not much worse." Clara poured tea. They sat close by the fire, bundled in wool and quiet understanding. The room flickered with firelight and shadow painting their faces in copper and coal. Maggie broke the silence first. "When I was little," she said, "my father said storms were how the mountains talked. Said they only screamed when folks stopped listening." Clara sipped her tea. "You think we've stopped listening?" Maggie glanced at Elias. "No. But I think some folks out there forgot how." Elias stared into the flames, the light carving out the lines in his face. He looked older in the firelight, not by years, but by weight. "I used to think silence was safer," he said suddenly, "that if I stayed far enough from people I couldn't hurt or be hurt." He paused, jaw tight. "Turns out silence is just another way to starve." The room went still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world had leaned in to listen. Clara reached across the space and set her hand near his, not quite touching, but close. "You're not starving anymore," she said. Elias looked at her, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. Not gratitude. Not exactly. Something deeper. Like recognition. Like breath after being underwater too long. Later, Maggie turned in early on the cot by the kitchen. Clara and Elias remained near the fire, the heat a thin shield against the storm howling outside. Clara pulled the bird carving from the mantel and turned it over in her palm. "I found this before I knew your name," she said. Elias looked down. Didn't know if it was welcome. It was. She offered it to him, but he shook his head. "It was never meant to come back to me." She set it down carefully beside the lantern, then folded her hands in her lap. "You didn't ask to be here," she said. "But you stayed." "I stayed because I couldn't walk away," he said, voice low. "Not from that night. Not from you." She didn't speak. Instead, she leaned toward him, slow, not reaching, just being there, closer than before. The space between them thinned. Not vanished, but loosened. Elias turned slightly, as if to rise, but stopped. "I was supposed to die up there," he whispered. Up in the high snow. That was the plan. Go quiet. No one to miss me. No one to bury me. Clara's voice was barely audible. But you didn't. No. He looked at her, and his voice cracked in the middle. I found your fence instead. And for a long moment, that's all there was. No fire crackle, no wind. Just two people sitting in a storm, holding a silence that felt full instead of empty. Clara reached for his hand. This time she didn't hesitate. This time he met her halfway. His fingers were cold, but his grip was steady. They sat like that for minutes or hours. It didn't matter. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, it didn't. When they finally rose to check the fire again, Elias paused by the window. The wind's starting to turn, he said. Clara joined him, her shoulder brushing his. Maybe it's just listening. He smiled at a small, tired thing. But real. They banked the fire one last time and turned in the wind, still swirling, but its howl less hungry now. That night, sleep came easier than either of them expected. And for once, neither dreamed of ghosts. In that hush between two breaths, she knew if he walked away now, something in her might never come back. The thaw came slow, not with blooming flowers or birdsong, but with the sound of dripping, steady, persistent. Snow pulling back inch by inch, ice receding from the trees, like breaths held too long. By mid-March, the trail near the ridge began to show patches of brown earth beneath the slush. Clara stood on the porch one morning, hands curled around a tin mug of coffee, watching mist rise off the ground, like smoke from some buried fire. The smell of wet pine filled the air. Inside, Elias packed. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. She heard it in the way he moved, quiet, practiced. Intentional. The trapline gear was back in its place. His old pack hung from a nail by the door. The small bundle of dried meat and herbs Clara had wrapped 2 nights earlier sat on the table untouched. When she came back in, he was buckling the flap on his satchel. "How long are you planning to be gone?" she asked, voice flat. He didn't look up. "Depends how far I get." Clara set the mug down slowly. "You said you weren't running anymore." "I'm not." "You sure as hell ain't staying." Elias's shoulders tensed. He turned finally, face unreadable. "This was never permanent, Clara. I told you that from the start." "No," she said. "You didn't tell me anything." The silence between them cracked like river ice. She crossed her arms. "What is this really about?" He hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Jed gave me this yesterday. Said a man came through town. Left this behind." He handed her the note. It was weather-worn, the ink faded. But the name at the bottom hit her like a bell struck deep. Micah Boone. Elias's brother. Her eyes flicked up to him. "He's alive, could be. Letters dated weeks ago. Says he's heading back toward Alberta, trapping up near the Peace River." "And you think you owe it to him," she said quietly. Elias nodded once. "He saved me more times than I can count. If there's even a chance." He trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Clara turned toward the stove, hands braced on the counter. "You don't have to go," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. "I do." She spun back to him, eyes sharp. "No, you want to. There's a difference." He didn't argue. Instead, he picked up the satchel and slung it over his shoulder. "I don't know if I'll find him. I don't know what's left of that part of me. But I can't ignore it." Clara stared at him. At the man who'd come out of the snow carrying nothing but a wooden cup and shame in his eyes. The man who now stood tall, shoulders set, looking more like someone whole than broken. She should have been proud. Instead, all she felt was cold again. Elias stepped toward the door. Clara. She raised her hand. Don't. He stopped. Her voice was soft but firm. If you're leaving, go. I won't chase a man into the snow. I've buried one already. The weight of those words hung heavy in the room. He lowered his eyes. I never meant to. You meant to disappear, she said. Same as before. Only this time you'll feel it when you go. Elias looked at her, then really looked like he was trying to memorize her face. She stood still, refusing to cry, refusing to fold. I'll return the carving, he said finally. Clara stepped forward, pulled the small bird from her pocket, the one with its wings tucked in, and placed it gently into his hand. It was never meant to come back to you, she whispered. You said so yourself. He held it like something fragile, like something sacred, then tucked it away. She didn't follow him outside, didn't watch him disappear down the trail. But long after the door shut behind him, she stood there, hands trembling at her sides, staring at the spot where he'd stood. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire crackled low and lonesome. The wind whispered around the eaves, asking questions she didn't want to answer. Near dawn, she sat in the rocking chair shawl, wrapped tight, eyes fixed on the quiet cabin door. And then 3 knocks. Firm, familiar. She opened the door slowly, breath catching in her throat. Jed Hawkins stood on the porch, lantern in one hand, envelope in the other. Figured you'd want this, he said. He left it with me before he went. Clara took the envelope, fingers shaking. Jed turned to leave, then paused. Sometimes folks leave because they think they're not allowed to stay. Doesn't mean they don't want to. She nodded, unable to speak. When Jed disappeared into the trees, she shut the door and opened the envelope. There was no long letter. Just 6 words. If I stay, let it be. Clara sat down at the table, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She read the note again, and again, and again. If I stay, he said, eyes locked with hers. I need to know it's not just because I'm tired of running. Elias returned on the 3rd morning, just after sunbreak. Clara saw him first as a shadow moving along the ridge trail, long and steady, cutting through the mist, like someone who'd never truly left. His pack was slung over one shoulder. Snow clung to his boots, but his steps were deliberate, not weary, not like a man drifting, but like a man choosing. She didn't go out to meet him. She stayed at the window, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, heart full of something too old to be called hope, but too stubborn to die. He stopped at the fence and looked up at the cabin. She opened the door. Morning, I said, voice quiet but even. You found what you were looking for. He shook his head. Didn't find him. She nodded once. Are you still going? No. Why? He took a slow breath. Because what I did find, I wasn't ready to leave behind. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't perfect. But it was enough. Clara stepped aside, letting him in. He placed the pack gently by the door, like someone returning to a house instead of just passing through. That day, Elias started building. He carved out a spot beside the cabin and raised a small lean-to from scratch. Didn't ask permission, didn't assume rights, just worked with quiet purpose. Clara helped where she could, passing nails, holding boards steady. It wasn't a home yet, but it was a shelter. On the 3rd evening, as they sat by the fire eating stew from the same pot, Elias looked at her and said, Does this place ever feel like it belonged to you? Clara didn't answer right away. It belonged to him, she said finally. Then it belonged to the silence. Maybe now. It can belong to both of us. Elias didn't say anything, but the next morning he built a second chair for the porch. That week rumors in town spread faster than fire on dry pine. Clara Rourke was letting a drifter live with her. Some said it was desperation. Others muttered about sin, about shame, about how a widow ought to act. Jed Hawkins didn't say much. He just kept his shop open and his eyes sharp. And when Maggie Lee stopped by for dried herbs, he slipped her a package wrapped in brown paper. "Make sure this gets to her," he said. "Some things are louder than gossip." The package held a new set of carving tools. The note read, "For the hands that remember how to stay." Clara found Elias by the edge of the woods that evening, whittling in the last light. "These from Jed?" he asked, unwrapping the leather roll. She nodded. "He's got eyes on everything. Eyes but no judgment." "Rare thing," Elias said, turning one of the chisels in his hand. "Like trust." He didn't say what he was carving. She didn't ask. The next morning, Tom Harrow returned. He rode up the trail with two men again, slower this time, deliberate. There was no pretense now, no fake smiles or friendly tones. Just cold eyes and the weight of possession. Clara stepped outside before they reached the porch. Tom dismounted, spit into the dirt. "You're harboring a thief, Clara." She didn't blink. "Not today. That deer he brought you last week, it came from my woods. That makes him a poacher. And you an accessory." Elias appeared at her side, stepping from behind the shed. Calm, steady, not apologizing. "I hunted no man's land," he said. "That range has been shared since the war." Tom sneered. "Was. I've got signatures that say something different." "You've got lies printed on fancy paper," Clara cut in. Tom took a step forward. "You siding with him over your own kind?" Clara's voice dropped low, sharp as a blade. "Folk don't act like you, Tom. He does." The two men beside Harrow shifted uneasily. One glanced toward Elias, then to Clara, then away. Tom's face turned red. "You sure you want to start something you can't finish?" "I already did," she said. "The day I didn't close my door on a man who came to me with nothing but a cup in his hand and shame in his eyes." The words landed heavy. For a second it looked like Tom might lunge. But then Elias stepped forward, not fast, not threatening, just a present. And something in the way he stood, the way he didn't flinch, made Tom pause. "You'll ride home now," Clara said, voice steady. "Or you'll answer to every soul in this valley who still remembers right from wrong." For a moment, it seemed like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then Tom spit again hard and turned. "We'll see," he growled. "The storm's not done yet." He mounted and rode off. The others followed. When the silence returned, it felt earned. Elias exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have done that." Clara turned to him. "You said that once before." He shook his head, almost smiling. "Didn't stop you then either." They stood there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, watching the trail empty. Later that evening, Elias repaired a shutter that had loosened in the wind. Clara baked bread and lined the windowsill with new jars, preserves she hadn't made in years. At dusk, she caught him watching her through the glass. Not in a way that demanded anything. Just seeing her. And for the first time, she didn't look away. They didn't talk about the next step, or the one after that. They just sat on the porch when the stars came out, two chairs side by side. Peace had settled like dust, soft and almost invisible but real. You've lived in this valley longer, Tom, but he's the one who's earned it. The first crocus pushed through the soil behind the cabin the day the last of the frost melted off the porch railing. It was small, stubborn, barely open. Clara knelt to brush away the wet leaves around it, smiling like it had spoken. Elias watched her from a few steps back, arms crossed loosely, morning light catching in his hair. They'd made it through the winter, not just the one wrapped in snow and wind, but the one that had lasted for years in both of them. The one no weather chart could measure. Elias had stopped building his lean-to weeks ago. It still stood mostly finished, but the tools had been left alone for days. The door to the cabin was no longer something he passed through politely. It was something he reached for without thinking. Clara made coffee every morning now with 2 mugs. Sometimes they sat in silence watching the ridges turn gold with first light. Other times they spoke about nothing in particular. The birds, the tracks near the stream, which trees were greening early. There was no need to name what they were. It was enough just to be. One afternoon, Clara found a new carving on the mantel. She hadn't heard him make it, but she knew it was his. It was another bird, but this one had its wings spread wide, caught in mid-flight. Beneath it, carved softly into the base, were 3 words, "You let me." She ran her fingers across the smooth grain, a lump catching in her throat. That night after supper, she asked, "What would you be doing right now if you hadn't come down that night?" Elias stirred his tea, sleeping by a fire, alone, listening to wind tear holes through a tent I never patched. You'd still be running. He looked at her quiet. I'd still be forgetting how to stop. Clara nodded. I almost didn't open the door. I know. They didn't say more. They didn't have to. Maggie came up that weekend with a satchel full of herbs and a smile that said she'd known how this would turn out all along. She hugged Elias like an old friend and told him he looked healthier. Less haunted, she added, grinning. Jed stopped by too, bringing fresh nails and a bag of flour as a poor excuse for checking in. The town's still talking, he said, half amused, half warning. But they've run out of venom. Now they just want stories. Let me tell them, Clara said. They will, Jed replied. But yours'll outlast theirs. When he left, he gave Elias a firm shake of the hand. Most folks leave, he said. You didn't. That's the whole story right there. Spring moved slow through Bitterroot like it knew not to startle anything. Days lengthened. The air softened. The river thawed. Elias fixed the fence. Clara planted bulbs in boxes by the window. Neither of them rushed. Then one morning, Clara stepped onto the porch and found a bundle leaning against the post, wrapped in hide. Inside was a folded cloth, a small jar of pine salve, and a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. Heard he stayed. Good. He needed somewhere. Now I know he found it. M. Boone. She held the note in both hands, reading it twice. 3 times. She turned and walked back inside. Elias stood by the stove pouring water over coffee grounds. She handed him the note. He read it without a word, then sat down hard at the table. I thought I'd never hear his name again, he said. Clara rested a hand on his shoulder. You were looking for him, she said. And maybe in a way, he was looking for you too. He didn't answer, but his hand came up and covered hers. That evening, Elias built a small cairn at the edge of the woods. 3 flat stones carefully placed. He didn't say what it was for. He didn't need to. The next morning, Clara found him sketching something in the dirt with a stick. A larger cabin. A porch wide enough for 3 chairs. Space for shelves. And light. She knelt beside him, watching. You think we'll build it? She asked. He nodded. Slowly, she smiled. Good. That's the only way worth doing it. The sun rose over the ridge, warming the earth inch by inch. Clara leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. His arm slid around her back, anchoring her without holding too tight. They didn't speak. They just breathed. Together. The fire had lasted through the darkest cold, and now in the soft hush of spring, it didn't need to roar. It just needed to stay lit. Because staying that was the whole of it. Staying took courage. Staying meant healing. Staying meant living again. He stayed, and that more than anything changed the shape of everything.